to the founders of this republic. Segment 2. You quote, in Republics Ancient and Modern, you quote historian Gilbert Chinard, quote, "We can hardly realize the power exerted by the classics at a time and in a land where only a few books were available," close quote. Briefly, give us some feeling for the intellectual context in which Adams and Jefferson and Madison were operating.
They're all brought up learning Latin, and the very best of them, Adams and Jefferson, learning Greek. So if you read their correspondence with one another, they will be discussing things and quoting the Greek back and forth to one another.
Terrible show-offs that they were.
People who are not as well educated have Plutarch in John Dryden's translation. So, what book would they have? They would have the Bible in the King James Version. They would often have Plutarch, and they would have Shakespeare. And oftentimes they learn their Roman history from reading Shakespeare's Roman plays. And if you look carefully at Shakespeare's Roman plays, I occasionally teach them, they're right out of Plutarch. He makes some adjustments, but he makes not very many changes. So the movement in the direction of republicanism in the 18th century and earlier in 17th century Britain takes place in the shadow of the ancient texts, of Thucydides, of Livy, of Tacitus, and I think above all else of Plutarch. There is a memory of a time when people governed themselves, and they governed themselves through public assemblies and through public debate.
Right. Two quotations, both drawn again from Republics Ancient and Modern. You quote Clinton Rossiter, quote, "The Americans would have believed just as vigorously in public morality had Cato and the Gracchi never lived." Hannah Arendt, without the classical example shining through the centuries, none of the men of the Revolution would have possessed the courage for what then turned out to be unprecedented action. Clinton Rossiter, yes, they had these books in their library. Yes, it may have informed the vocabulary they used in talking about the circumstances they encountered, but they'd have come to the same result. Hannah Arendt, those books in the library were central to the endeavor.
Hannah Arendt is right, and Clinton Rossiter is wrong. Keep in mind, the Americans of that generation, especially the leading men, they begin with a legal quarrel with Britain over the question of taxation. They are driven against their wills, really, to begin to think about independence. When they think about independence, they rethink government and they eliminate the king. How is it that they get to eliminating the king? The answer is they have been brought up on the classics of Greece and Rome, and it has fired their imaginations. And so a man like John Adams finds himself in a situation in which he says, my gosh, we're going to be able to do what Romulus did, what Lycurgus did, what Solon did. In other words, they think of themselves as lawgivers, as legislators, as framers of constitutions, first at the state level and then at the national level. And they begin to think about themselves on that classical model. Now, Hannah Arendt talks about the courage. Well, the answer is this was done before. We can do it again.
So what's your important lesson for students at Hillsdale and students everywhere, I think, if I get it right? As they looked at lived political reality in their time, looking back to Europe, monarchies, principalities, this model was everywhere.
Yes.
To them, the models in the books, the ancient histories they read, they were such good students and had such imaginative powers that what they saw in the book was as real an option as the options presented to them by the reality of their day.
Absolutely. And by the way, you can see the same thing in France in the years leading up to the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. The American Revolution fires the imagination of Frenchmen because they see something happening on the other side of the Atlantic. They have read these same books, and suddenly Cato becomes real to them. and you begin to get David doing these sort of classical scenes in the decades before the revolution. So they're beginning to think along those lines. Another way of putting it is the modern nation state is an attempt to recapture what the ancient Greeks and Romans had.
Now, Paul, you write, once again from Republics Ancient and Modern, you write to quote, set the modern republic alongside the Greek republic so that the elements of continuity and discontinuity in the history of republicanism can become visible. We're recording a webcast. This is like trying to reduce an ox to a bouillon cube, but as briefly as you can, what did the American founders accept and what did they reject from the ancient Greek example?
Okay. The American founders not only are drawing on classical literature, they're also drawing on a large body, from Machiavelli to Montesquieu, of early modern European literature, all of which is written as a kind of reflection upon the ancient experience. Mm-hmm. That literature is both inspired by liberty in ancient Greece and liberty in ancient Rome, by Herodotus, Thucydides, and Livy, and Cicero, and so forth. And it is critical of the failure of the ancient Greek cities and of ancient Rome. So the Americans inherit both the ancient example as an inspiration and the criticism of the ancient example. And of course, the ancient Greek republics blew up. They failed. Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great conquered them. Rome grows. It conquers the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean, and then the Romans lose their liberty. So there is a meditation that goes on from the 16th century through the 18th century, through the middle of the 18th century, that the Americans have inherited. They have read Machiavelli. They have read David Hume. They have read Montesquieu. And they have thought critically about the failure of the ancient republics. So what the Americans are trying to do is to succeed where the ancient republics failed.
Paul, why wouldn't a disinterested observer look at this experiment and say, the arrogance is breathtaking? They are saying, here is a monarchy which has been in existence for 6 centuries in Britain. If you compare Britain to Europe, they have greater wealth and greater liberties than anywhere else in Europe, anywhere else in the known world at the time, with the exception of the colonies here. But still, the British example isn't all that bad for all the Lord North's ministry. They're saying, Rome, oh yes, it may have lasted 1,000 years, but we can do better than that. And then they go back to ancient Greece. They go back to Pericles and say, tut-tut, it had its faults, which we can correct. I mean, isn't there something a little bit overweening about the whole project? How do you handle that?
Well, look, if you had talked to any one of the people who are going to be important in the year 1762 or 1763,
right,
and you had told them what they were going to do, they would have looked at you as if you were insane. They were all loyal monarchists. They were all admirers of the British Constitution. They come to be frustrated with the British Constitution because of the way they're being treated. And of course, there are political disputes in Britain going on at the same time, in which there are radical Whigs critical of the workings of the British Constitution, in particular of the use of patronage and of corruption.
Right.
They inherit that discourse too and begin to take it more and more seriously as they become frustrated with the way Britain is treating them. And at a certain point, they realize they're going to have to go it alone. And it's then that ambition kicks in. And you're absolutely right. The ambition is breathtaking. It is not mad, however. Underpinning it is the fact that the population of North America is doubling every 10 years. Benjamin Franklin has written an essay on this. And Franklin is a man who, from very early on, imagined a British Empire that was ruled from here and not from the other side. He saw that the colonies were gaining in weight and that the time would come, and he could project right into the future demographically, that the colonies would actually be a bigger source of wealth than England itself.
So, Paul, republics ancient and modern, we have here 25 centuries. Take the moment, 1787, the Constitution is presented for ratification. That republic, as it is about to come into the world, ranks where, in your estimation, in the long history of republics? How good a job did they do?
It is the greatest of the republics.